March 15, 1944. Japanese Naval Intelligence Base, Ada, northeast of Tokyo. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara looked at the radio, adjusted the dial, and pressed the headphones to his ears. In front of him, a spectrogram showed consistent rhythmic sound waves with complex intonations. He listened in silence. After 3 years of war, his team had broken American diplomatic codes, the British Army's cipher systems, and even the U.S. State Department's famous purple. But that was different. It is incomprehensible. That transmission, picked up in the Pacific, came from the American front line. It was military, it was real, it was organized. But none of the 30 experts in the cryptography division could understand a single word. Japan, a master at deciphering the enemy's secrets, was faced with a code that resisted everything. And the most humiliating thing, it had not been generated by machines, ciphers, or algorithms. It was spoken, and spoken by men who, until recently, could not even use their mother tongue in American public schools. This is the technical, historical, and symbolic account of the only unbreakable code of the Second World War, and of the invisible war that Japan lost, without even realizing it had begun. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story with surgical precision. During more than 1,000 days of war, the Japanese intercepted thousands of American transmissions, clean, complete, recorded with state-of-the-art technology. They applied tonal analysis, spectrograms, statistical modeling, consultations with linguists, Buddhist monks, and even attempts at vocal imitation. Result? 0. Not a word understood. Not a single one. 30 elite, full-time cryptanalysts have completely failed in the face of a language spoken by less than 0.1% of the U.S. population, a language that had been banned in schools and ignored by the American government itself. This is the story of how one of the most disciplined empires of the 20th century was blinded by something that could not be quantified, and defeated by a voice that was never meant to be heard outside of its own people. If you value this type of historical reconstruction based on sources, numbers, and hidden facts, leave your like and subscribe. This is what allows us to continue revealing what the books failed to tell. 2 kilometers from the outskirts of Tokyo, hidden under rows of trees and camouflaged roofs, operated one of the most sophisticated Japanese intelligence facilities during World War II, the Ada Communications Unit. There, 118 high-frequency receivers operated 24 hours a day, powered by a force of 500 listening and transcription specialists. These men and women, trained for years in the best technical schools of Imperial Japan, operated under a simple and arrogant premise. All American information could be intercepted, classified, and with enough time and effort understood. And it wasn't a bluff. By 1940, the Japanese had already penetrated Purple, the American diplomatic encryption system, accurately deciphering the communications of the U.S. State Department. They had also broken parts of British naval traffic and captured entire Chinese systems. This succession of victories consolidated a doctrine of full confidence in his analytical capacity. The problem, as history would reveal, is that this trust completely ignored the possibility of a code that was born not of technique, but of culture. The Japanese eavesdropping operation was rigorous. Teams took turns in soundproofed rooms, translating broadcasts into English, French, Dutch, Cantonese, Mandarin, Russian. Tactical frequencies were monitored based on usage patterns. The American code M209, for example, was familiar to analysts, decipherable with effort, but possible. The British Type X system showed resistance, but its structure was intelligible. In contrast, transmissions from naval units in the South Pacific began to draw attention for the anomaly. Tactical, highly functional content, transmitted clearly, but in a language that was not included in any linguistic database of the empire. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara, who was in charge of Ada, described in a confidential report that the rhythmic structures, although standardized, did not correspond to any known language, neither European, nor Asian, nor Pacific. In Japanese imperial logic, this situation was temporary. It was enough to collect more samples, invest more analysts, apply more tools. So it was done. For months, wax cylinders stored complete transmissions. Linguists from Kyoto Imperial University were summoned for phonetic analysis. Experts in indigenous Filipino languages were brought from Manchuria. In 1943, An additional effort was ordered. 30 sound cryptanalysis analysts were assigned exclusively to those incomprehensible transmissions. The premise was the same as it had worked before. Time, discipline, and science would solve everything. But nothing solved. The frequency was American. The content was military. But the language, it sounded like some kind of tribal music. Repetitions, closed syllables, tonal variations with no apparent logic, something profoundly human and, paradoxically, technically impenetrable. This was the contradiction that Japan had not yet realized. In a scenario where they relied on their own analytical superiority, they were being defeated by something that did not fit into their systems of interpretation. And this defeat was silent, invisible, humiliating. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States didn't even bother about the possibility of interception, because it knew there was no way to decode it. The code was not written. There were no books. It was just talked, and only understood by a highly trained group, whose language was not even taught in American public schools. At this point, a pause is in order. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced more than 400,000 coded broadcasts using the Navajo language. None have been deciphered, not one. To put this in perspective, during the same period, Japan partially deciphered more than 20% of Chinese encrypted traffic, 15% of British, and 12% of traditional American. But against Navajo? Zero. The contrast between expectation and reality was absolute. If this discrepancy surprises you, comment now. Logistics wins, absolute power, or simply, unbelievable. Because for Japan, this was exactly that, unbelievable. The irony deepens when understanding what, in fact, sustained this Japanese failure. It was more than a code. It was a worldview. Japan prepared to face machines. What he faced was an ancestral culture, structured on metaphors and tones that no Western or Eastern logic foresaw. While Japanese intelligence drowned in frequency spectra, comparative tables, and sound graphs, the U.S. Marines just talked, matter-of-factly and accurately. The secret was not in the numbers. It was in the soul of the language. And it is at this point that the story changes axis. Because while Ada sank into silence and frustration, on the other side of the world, a civilian mind saw what even the generals had not realized, that America's greatest weapon could come from a nearly extinct language. A man without rank, but with access to two worlds, was about to present to the high command a proposal that would change the course of the war. The American answer to Japanese eavesdropping would not be a new machine. It would be a language, and this decision would be born not from algorithms, but from childhood, coexistence, and translation. Before any American machine was designed to fool Japanese ears, another machine already existed, organic, alive, fluid. The Navajo language, spoken by less than 1% of the U.S. population, was by nature already a code. It is a closed code. In the structure of the language, there are not only words, but actions conjugated in layers, where a single verb can contain subject, tense, mood, and intention. Navajo is a language of high agglutination. An entire sentence can be said in a single word, constructed with suffixes and prefixes whose variation borders on infinity. For an external listener, there is no fixed point of reference. And to an analyst trained in regular phonemes and predictable sounds, the language seemed chaotic, illogical, not to be learned. Fundamental sounds don't exist in Japanese, or even in English. Lateral fricatives, glottalizations, nasalized vowels, ascending and descending tones that completely alter the meaning of words. Intonation errors turn an order into nonsense. The same word pronounced with slight variation can mean to attack, to fly, or to die. What the Japanese called a repetitive structure proved to be a web of sound where every nuance changed everything. The impact of this phonology was immediate. Not even slowed recordings with optical equipment, not even high-precision spectrograms could map patterns. The language operated outside the Western logic of frequency and repetition. In Navajo, there were no direct synonyms, no universal words. Everything was symbolic, relative, codified in natural metaphors. Water was not water, but blood of the earth. An airplane was not an airplane, it was an iron hummingbird. Tank, armored turtle. Nouns did not exist as absolutes. They were created according to context, action, and purpose. For the Japanese analyst, accustomed to numerical codes and fixed patterns, this was a puzzle without borders. More than that, the Navajo language was a language of survival. For centuries, the Diné people, as they call themselves, have been forced to preserve their language in silence. Boarding schools, physical punishment, state prohibition. The language had been persecuted by the very government that now, ironically, would place it at the center of its security doctrine. This detail carries symbolic weight. While Japan invested billions of yen in technological interception, the United States would bet on what it had tried to eradicate for generations, and win for it. The stronghold lay within men who had been taught to hide their own voices. The empire, prepared to withstand bombs, never imagined that it would be brought down by sounds it could not name. At Ada's listening base, the discomfort grew. As the volume of transmissions increased, it became more evident that these messages were not random. They had rhythm. There were breaks. They repeated structures. But they didn't fit into anything that the Japanese linguistic databases had. Japanese intelligence consulted Kwantung Army archives, interrogated Filipinos, compared them with records of Pacific Aboriginal languages, even thought it was a cipher form of Russian. Nothing matched. Nothing made sense. And the most disturbing thing, the more they listened, the clearer it became that the problem was not in the cipher. It was in the language itself. Even if some analyst had the intuition to decipher, the morphological structure of the Navajo made any approximation impossible. Because, unlike English, where words are repeated frequently, allowing statistical analysis, Navajo had a verbal system so vast that repetition was almost non-existent. The same order could be said in 12 different ways, and all correct. Each speaker, with his own rhythm and tradition, articulated the codes in a unique way but always intelligible to the trained. To outsiders, it was like trying to follow a river that changes course at every turn. A code within a culture, protected by an invisible structure. The context. Commander Kurihara began to suspect something unusual when he realized that not even Japanese phonologists, trained to recognize Mandarin tonal structures, could transcribe the sounds. The recordings, even slowed down, did not deliver recognizable segments. This put the Navajo in entirely new territory, neither cipher nor common foreign language. It was, in the words of a confidential Japanese report, a language of war created by nature itself. And most disconcertingly, it had not been created for war, just adapted. She was alive before the conflicts. He lived in the songs, in the prayers, in the stories. The war only revealed what was already there, and that Japan never knew how to face. An enemy who carried his gun at his throat. In late 1943, a Japanese linguist suggested something bold, that the language might have Native American origin. The proposal was dismissed by senior officers as implausible. The reason? No industrialized country would use a tribal language for high-level military communications. This answer was not just technical, it was ideological. It revealed the structural contempt that the Japanese Empire had for any form of culture that was not centralized, hierarchical, and above all, codifiable. What they didn't know was that the United States was about to do just that, make official the military use of an ancestral language, not as a symbol but as a functional weapon. And the man who was going to propose this was not a general, he was not a politician, he was not a cryptographer. He was just someone who grew up where true power was spoken, and who knew better than anyone that what the Japanese called noise was actually command. The next voice in history would not come from Washington, nor from Tokyo. He would come from Gallup, New Mexico, and it would forever change the course of the war. In 1942, as U.S. military engineers perfected long-range radios and cipher systems like the M209, a retired civilian knocked on the door of Marine Corps headquarters at Camp Elliott, California, with a proposal outside of protocol. His name was Philip Johnston. The son of Presbyterian missionaries, Johnston had grown up in the Navajo Nation, spoke the language fluently, and knew the symbolic, spiritual, and linguistic universe of that people like few others. He had served as an officer in World War I, and as he read in the newspapers about the experimental use of the Choctaw language in previous battles, he saw something that military planners had not yet considered, that Navajo, because of its sonic complexity, verbal structure, and lack of familiarity outside the tribe, was a ready-made code, natural, infiltrable only with culture. It is therefore ideal for modern warfare. Johnston had no official position, rank, or support, but it had perfect logic. Why insist on mechanical ciphers when the enemies themselves expected machines and completely ignored what was spoken among the mountains of the American Southwest? The proposal was met with skepticism, but a test was authorized. On February 28, 1942, Johnston gathered 4 fluent Navajo, still civilians, and simulated the transmission of messages between military posts. The messages encoded in Navajo were transmitted and decoded with accuracy, clarity, and most of all, speed. While the M209, the official tactical encryption equipment, took an average of 30 minutes to encode and decode simple orders, the Navajos completed the cycle in less than 30 seconds. The officers present recorded the time. They passed on the information, and the result was unequivocal. It was functional. It was not symbolic. It was not exotic. He was militarily superior. The language of those who had been persecuted in boarding schools was now being considered a tool of command. But it was not enough to speak Navajo. It was necessary to create a system of war within the language. Philip Johnston knew this, and the Marines knew that this would require more than translators. It would require soldiers. In May 1942, the first group of 29 young Navajos was officially incorporated into the United States Marine Corps. Hailing from isolated communities in Arizona and New Mexico, some had grown up as sheep herders, others had been punished for speaking their language at school. Now, that same language would be his weapon. The new recruits were taken to a secluded facility at Camp Elliott. There, without paper, without manuals, without written records, they created, from memory, a complete military coding system. Metaphors, phonetic conventions, multiple variations per letter to avoid statistical patterns. Each term was based on Navajo cultural logic. A destroyer became an iron fish, a bomber, vulture, a fighter, fast hummingbird. The construction of the code was not only creative, it was meticulously planned to withstand all kinds of external scrutiny. For example, the letter A could be represented by ant, wolachi, apple, bilasayana, or axe, tseo, each with phonetically distinct sounds. This made it impossible to identify frequent patterns, one of the pillars of Japanese cryptanalysis. At the end of the training phase, 201 terms were memorized in full by the coders. There were no notebooks. There were no drafts. Each man carried the entire code in his mind. Once deployed, they would be self-sufficient, impossible to compromise. For the first time, the United States was betting not only on more tanks, more ships, or more bombs. They were betting on something that Japan could not foresee, a tactical system based on orality, culture, and memorization, with no physical record, no external vulnerability, no precedent. What the Japanese General Staff could never have imagined is that, at the heart of the command effort of American forces in the Pacific, the language of the voiceless would be driving entire battles. The enemy, trained to intercept silences, algorithms, and automated transmissions, had no preparation for what he would hear next. Human voices, animal metaphors, ancestral tones used as a war map. And when the first messages began to be transmitted directly from the battlefield, loudly over the radio, instead of confusing Americans, it was the Japanese Empire that was confused. They expected machines. What they heard was memory, and memory, this time, spoke louder than any figure. In 1942, Japanese intelligence reports had not yet detected the new pattern. Navajo broadcasts did not stand out in frequency, but rather in content. What they conveyed was vital. Artillery positions, air coordination, evacuation requests, loss reports. Everything went through the Navajo announcers. But even the most experienced Japanese operators could not even identify that they were facing a new language. To them, it sounded like a sequence of meaningless sounds, tribal, fragmented, impossible to transcribe. And there was the turning point. Japan, which had invested millions in war engineering, was now vulnerable to something it had never considered a threat. Decades later, General Alexander Vandegrift, Commandant of the Marines, would write, "The Navajos have proven to be faster, safer, and more reliable than any technical device we have used." The phrase was not rhetorical. It was statistics. And the proof of this would come in the following weeks. when the first coders were sent to the Pacific, and Japan finally began to hear what it could not understand. Because while analysts looked for logic in circuits, Americans had found an advantage in a place that the empire had never been able to map, inside the soul of a language. And what was about to happen on Guadalcanal would not just be a tactical victory, it would be the stark demonstration that the information war had already been won, even before the first shot. Inside an isolated building at Camp Elliott, the first 29 Navajo recruits were locked under constant surveillance for 8 weeks. No external contact, no notebooks allowed, only voices, memory, and logic. There, between silent walls and with their uniforms still smelling new, the young people began to erect what would be the most effective tactical code of the war, not with machines, but with metaphors. The mission was clear: to translate the entirety of American military vocabulary into a language that had never described tanks, destroyers, or bombers. The solution was not literal, it was symbolic. A fighter jet became dahi-ti-hi, hummingbird, agile, fast, cutting through the air. A submarine was beshlo, ironfish. Bombers were called jay-sho, buzzards that circle before impact. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content and rescue these forgotten stories. The choice of metaphors was not only cultural, it was strategic. By using images of nature, common to the Navajo universe, the coders created a transmission system that was easily memorized, but absolutely airtight to any outside listener. Each military term was given a designation based on visual associations. The aircraft carrier became Tcd-Neal, giant bird, a light tank, Chetagahi, fast turtle. These images could not be predicted nor translated literally because they did not follow conventional standards, and that made the code unbreakable. More than a language barrier, it was a symbolic wall. The Japanese, accustomed to dissecting words in graphs, would come across meanings without input. There was no etymological root. There was no key. There was context, culture, and above all, internal logic. To ensure even more safety, the sounds themselves were manipulated. The phonetic alphabet was created with multiple options per letter to avoid frequency analysis. The letter E, the most common in English, had 4 variations, and the announcers randomly switched between them. The idea was simple. If the same letter could be transmitted as ear, water, deer, or mud, no pattern would be detectable by interceptors. This made messages not only encoded, but unpredictable. The system was dynamic, fluid, a code made to escape binary logic. This process of creation was not improvised. He was disciplined. Each coder memorized the hundreds of terms with absolute precision. Mistakes were not tolerated. Drills included intense repetitions, variations under stress, and even exercises with noise interference to simulate the battlefield. They weren't just speaking Navajo. They were reconfiguring the language to become a tool of war, and they did so with a sense of responsibility that went beyond the military mission. As Chester Nez, one of the originals, said, "In our culture, words have power. Speaking correctly was sacred. Each transmission was more than an order. It was a vote, a coded prayer." For Japan, none of this was visible. They heard voices, but they didn't understand. They analyzed the transmissions with sophisticated tools, but without the human component that allowed them to decode symbols. They could not imagine that the sounds represented bees attacking, owls landing, or lightning falling. These images, even if interpreted, would never reveal the true military meaning behind it. And even if they captured an encoder, as they would later try, nothing would still be revealed. Because the code was not on paper, it was in my head, and in the soul. This method, so simple and so effective, placed the United States in an unprecedented position. For the first time in the war, it had a completely inviolable communication system, and most ironically, it had not been invented by Harvard scientists nor by engineers at Bell Labs. It had been created by young Navajos from a forgotten land, using elements of their own environment and tradition. What Japan called tribal weakness would prove to be one of the most advanced weapons in information warfare. By the end of that summer, the code was ready. Compact, oral, precise. It was the opposite of everything that traditional cryptography predicted. There was no algorithm, no mechanical figures. But there were layers, ambiguity, and an invisible architecture that no machine could get through. When the final tests were conducted in simulated combat environments, the superiority was stark. While it took an operator with an M209 up to half an hour to compose and decode a tactical message, the Navajos took less than 20 seconds, even under pressure, noise, or sleep deprivation. And that's what convinced the Marine High Command. The code was ready for the battlefield. It was to be shipped to the Pacific, and the first real test would soon come, not against machines, but against the empire that thought it was a master of listening and deciphering. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese believed they understood everything, but what they would hear there would have no translation. The invisible war was about to begin, and this time, it would be stopped by voices that Japan would never be able to silence. August 1942. Guadalcanal. The jungle teemed with the acidic smell of gunpowder and rain as the U.S. 1st Marine Corps landed on the beaches of the strategic island. It was the beginning of the first major American ground offensive in the Pacific, and more discreetly, the first real test of the Navajo Code in combat. 15 coders had been integrated into the tactical units, operating radios in the field and transmitting messages that could not be intercepted. At the Japanese command of the 8th Fleet in Rabaul, Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada monitored the radio frequencies closely. From the beginning of the campaign, the Japanese had been able to anticipate Allied movements by intercepting conventional transmissions and deciphering the patterns. But that week, something changed. The voices that reached Rabaul's receivers sounded distinct, fast, tonal, almost sung. No operator could identify the language. No pattern made sense. For the first time in the war, Japanese intelligence was silenced. The operational difference was immediate. While conventional units still relied on the M209 machine, which required up to half an hour to encrypt, transmit, decipher, and confirm a message under enemy fire, Navajo coders did it in less than 30 seconds, from issuance to execution. Artillery coordinates, retreat orders, updates on Japanese positions, everything flowed uninterrupted, with millimeter accuracy and unprecedented speed. And more importantly, without the slightest risk of compromise. The Japanese listened to the broadcasts, recorded the voices, stored the sounds in wax cylinders, but they did not understand a word. In the daily reports of Japanese intelligence, vague comments appeared: unknown language, tonal similarities with Pacific languages, unidentifiable structure, but no progress. On the field, the effects were decisive. On one occasion, the coder Chester Nez transmitted in less than 15 seconds the exact location of a Japanese machine gun nest, hidden on a steep slope and camouflaged by vegetation. Less than 2 minutes later, the target had been neutralized by a radio-coordinated naval artillery strike. The broadcast was picked up, yes. The Japanese heard it, but they failed to act. The information war, which until then had been dominated by the Empire, began to slip through the hands of its operators. The broadcasts were on the air, but they were shielded by invisible symbols. The sophistication of the American response was partly technological. The SCR-300 radios allowed for more robust mobile communication than any Japanese equipment at the time. But the real difference was not in the equipment. It was in the symbiosis between machine and language. The SCR-300 amplified the voice, but it was the Navajo language that made it incomprehensible. A system of warfare that mixed the rusticity of ancestral orality with the fluidity of modern operations. And the Japanese, trained to intercept technology, did not know how to combat tradition. Frustration grew. The reports sent to Ada's base in Tokyo reported a new type of threat, transmissions that were not only fast and accurate, but also immune to any attempt at statistical analysis. In a conventional operation, patterns emerge naturally. Repetitions of words, frequency of sounds, rhythm of emission, all of this feeds into cryptanalysis. But with the Navajo, the structure of the language itself prevented this. The agglutinative language and its multiple ways of expressing the same idea nullified the possibility of predicting meanings. Phonetic analysis was useless. Sound segmentation, ineffective. It was like trying to decipher music without knowing the scale, the instrument, or the melody. During the campaign, Major Howard Connor, communications officer for the 5th Marine Division, directly supervised the coders and attested to their effectiveness. Without them, we would not have taken the island. The messages flowed with a speed and security that no cipher or electronic code could achieve. He later wrote in his diary, "What started as an experiment became doctrine. In each new battle, more coders were requested, and with each Japanese report, more evidence emerged that something on that front had changed. The enemy was mute, literally. In retrospect, the shock was predictable. Japan hoped to win the information war based on effort, discipline, and technique. But its failure was not operational. It was conceptual. They prepared to intercept machines. What they faced was something that no machine deciphers, a living language, inseparable from the identity of those who speak it. While engineers tried to isolate sounds in laboratories, the Marines just talked, naturally, urgently, and above all safely. The very existence of the code was already an affront to Japanese logic, a weapon that could not be seen, touched, or replicated. And if in Guadalcanal the impact was tactical, in the following months it would become strategic. In battle after battle, the Navajos would extend their hold on the flow of war without missing a single broadcast, without allowing a single message to be understood by the enemy. In late 1942, Japanese intelligence officially recorded its inability to decode the messages of unidentified origin from the Pacific Theater, and he requested the immediate capture of a live operator, because the invisible war was just beginning, and for the Empire, the only way to try to beat it would be to capture a man whose only weapon was his own tongue. April 1942. In the chaotic retreat from Bataan in the Philippines, hundreds of American soldiers are captured by Imperial Japanese forces. Among them was a man whose presence would go unnoticed by most Allied commanders, but who, months later, would become the desperate focus of Japanese cryptanalysis. His name, Joe Kalumia, a Navajo, fluent speaker of his native language, a prisoner who, for the Japanese, seemed to be the final key to deciphering the mystery that haunted them since Guadalcanal. It didn't matter that Kalumia wasn't a coder. For Ada's intelligence officers, the mere fact that he understood the language made him a precious resource. The plan was simple and brutal. Interrogate him until he revealed the code that the best analysts of the Empire could not break. But there was one problem that the interrogators didn't foresee. Joe Kalumia understood the words, but he didn't understand the code. Taken to a special interrogation facility, Kalumia was confronted with intercepted recordings directly from the battlefield. Navajo voices, familiar intonations, recognizable terms. He heard phrases like, "The turtle attacks the iron fish," or "The hummingbird carries the eggs." Known words, yes, but its meaning, incomprehensible, because those phrases were not common language. They were tactical translations encapsulated in military metaphors that only made sense to those who had been trained in the system developed at Camp Elliott. The Navajo code wasn't just language. It was structure, discipline, and the logic of war. None of these things Joe possessed. He was a captured soldier, not a code talker. The response of the Japanese was predictable. They did not believe it. Accused of lying, Kalumia was subjected to systematic torture for months. Sessions of beatings, sleep deprivation, suspension by the arms for hours, simulated drownings, and in the winter of 1943, an even crueler practice. He was left naked on the snow until his feet froze on the ground. It was believed that under extreme pressure any man would speak up, but what they didn't understand was that even if he wanted to talk, there was nothing to reveal. The knowledge required to understand the messages was not linguistic, it was operational. In a last-ditch attempt, the Japanese offered food in exchange for translations. Joe Kalumia, already reduced to less than 45 kilograms, looked at the interpreters and told the truth they refused to accept. "I understand what those words mean at home, but on the radio I don't know what they mean." Frustration turned to paranoia. An internal report of Japan's cryptanalysis division dated May 1943 recorded, "The prisoner appears to master the language, but demonstrates a total inability to interpret the contents of the transmissions. Inaccessible specific training is suspected." Without knowing it, they were exactly right, and exactly powerless. The historical irony crystallizes at this moment. An empire that had broken complex diplomatic codes, that had deciphered the ciphers of the British Army and the American Navy, was now faced with an insurmountable obstacle, not because it lacked machines or specialists, but because it lacked cultural understanding. Japan's strategic mistake was to think that force, fear, and insistence could open a door that could only open with memory, context, and symbolic logic. No password existed. No manuals could be captured. The code was a living, mutable organism, transmitted by oral training and tactical practice. And for an empire that valued hierarchy, discipline, and technology, this was incomprehensible language. Joe Kyalumia endured for more than 3 years in captivity. He survived the end of the war and returned home. It never had the recognition it deserved, but his enforced silence ultimately represented the triumph of the unbreakable, because he betrayed nothing, because there was nothing to betray. It was like demanding that a singer without a score reconstruct an entire symphony from fragments of sound. The Navajo Code was just that, a score that could only be performed by the musicians who composed it. And Joe, though he spoke the language, did not know the secret melody. The attempt to break the code through torture failed. And it didn't just fail. It revealed the desperation of an empire that no longer knew how to listen. The Japanese listened to sounds that seemed organized, recorded the tones with precision instruments, analyzed the frequency spectrums, but everything remained indecipherable. The only chance they had to understand, placed before them in the flesh, also proved useless. And in this failure, the lesson was clear. You cannot destroy what you do not understand. The acknowledgement of failure came unofficially. In the halls of Ada, officers whispered that there was something in the language of the Navajos that defied the very logic of modern warfare, something that was not a cipher, but an essence. And in the following months, the resources began to be redirected. More recordings, more phonological tests, more imitation attempts, all without result. Because the problem was not technical, he was philosophical. The Japanese war was a war of predictability. The Navajo Code, an art of unpredictability, a system where each word carried a story, each metaphor a geography, each sound a generation of meanings. And yet, the empire did not retreat. If they couldn't understand it from the inside, they would try to capture it from the outside. The new order was clear. Capture a trained coder alive, and with your radio. Because now, more than ever, they knew that it wasn't just the language. It was the set, the operator, the context, the practice, the equipment. The next phase of the silent war would be a race against time, before the code became dominant on all fronts of the Pacific. And that rush would lead the Japanese to invest in one of the most aggressive interception campaigns of the war, where every Navajo broadcast was recorded, slowed down, studied, dissected. But, as we shall see, all this would only deepen the gulf between sound and meaning, because the next step of the empire would be to transform linguistics into visual science. And failure would be even more devastating. In the aseptic corridors of the Ada unit, frustration began to exceed the limit of reason. Wax cylinders full of transmissions were no longer enough. Specialized phonographers, linguists recruited from imperial universities, or even Zen monks consulted for their familiarity with ancestral phonemes, were not enough. In 1943, Japan allocated 30 full-time cryptanalysts exclusively to the enigma that came from the Pacific, Navajo broadcasts. The hope was simple, that at some point some pattern would emerge. But standard requires predictable logic, and what they faced was something entirely outside the Western cartography of codes. Each attempt to organize the data revealed more chaos. The words, when repeated, came with different intonations. The sentences, even similar, never had the same sound structure. Nothing, absolutely nothing, obeyed the rules. And it was in this absence of logic that the system collapsed. Japan, accustomed to defeating the enemy with discipline and repetition, was forced to improvise. Music analysis techniques began to be tested to map the tones of Navajo speech. Oscilloscopes were employed to graphically visualize the transmissions. The hope was that if they didn't understand with their ears, they could at least decipher with their eyes. The sound waves were dissected as if they were whale sounds, trying to identify curves, pauses, intonations. Nothing worked. Engineers created speech-slowing equipment that allowed them to study word by word at low speed, and even then, the sounds dissolved into unmatched phonemes. The frustration reached the point where the operators began to assign code names to the broadcasts. The wind sings, the tree cries, the code of the spirits. Each name was an involuntary acknowledgement that it was beyond technical understanding. It was more than language. It was an unrecognizable cultural force. In parallel, Japanese intelligence tried to reduce chaos to mathematics. A statistical analysis system was created to calculate the frequency of sounds and repetitions in different transmissions. The logic was old. Any language tends to repeat certain syllables, certain structures. But the Navajo code's response was destructive. For each letter, there were multiple possible words. For each command, multiple metaphors. There was no regularity. Each operator decided in fractions of a second which image to use to transmit the same instruction. The letter A, for example, could be represented by ant, apple, arrow, or plane. The use was random, deliberate, and trained to destroy precisely what Japanese intelligence sought: patterns. The analyses, with dozens of graphs and curves, revealed a single conclusion. The code did not repeat itself. He did not let himself be anticipated. It wasn't embedded in binary logic. It was art in motion. And at that point, ideological collapse was inevitable. The same men who had cracked the purple code, the American diplomatic cipher considered inviolable, were now kneeling before recordings that came from soldiers with little or no formal education, using a language that had been banned for decades in American schools. An empire armed with tanks, battleships, torpedoes, and submarines was being defeated, day after day, by a handful of voices coming from the deserts of New Mexico. The humiliation was total, and internal reports were beginning to admit bankruptcy. A September 1944 internal document from Lieutenant Commander Masao Yamada noted, "We have identified a certain rhythm and timing in the transmissions. There are indications that the messages follow operational orders, but semantic comprehension remains null. The source seems to be outside our technical scope." Pause for a shocking fact. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States trained more than 400 Navajo code talkers to operate in 6 divisions of the Marine Corps. In all, they transmitted more than 20,000 messages in battles such as Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. None, absolutely none, were deciphered by the enemy. And now an invitation to reflection. If this statistic impressed you, type it in the comments. Absolute power, unbelievable, or logistics wins. Because what is in front of us is not just a given. It is the portrait of an empire defeated not by tanks but by sounds, not by bombs, but by metaphors. Japanese desperation did not stop at technical analysis. In an unprecedented measure, they requested help from Nazi Germany, the other axis of totalitarian power. A formal request for language assistance was sent to Berlin in 1944, but the effort died before it was born. Germany, mired on the Eastern Front, had no translators of Native American languages. Its cryptographers had no idea how to deal with a language that didn't use Latin alphabets, that didn't obey Indo-European phonemes, that couldn't be typed, printed, or reproduced without years of cultural immersion. What seemed simple, a primitive language, turned out to be the most advanced challenge of the war, and here the irony reaches its apex. Japan, which structured its war on the basis of anticipation, which trained generations of officers to interpret every detail of the Western machine, which invested in interceptions as a strategic weapon, was now blind, literally blind. Every tactical transmission of the U.S. Marines was coded with indecipherable sounds. No foresight, no understanding, no reaction. The impact was direct. Positions bombed without warning, coordinated attacks without detection, flanks mobilized in absolute silence. It was as if the enemy army was fighting under an invisible cloak. And all this not through futuristic technology, but through voices trained in an ancient oral tradition. Colonel Takashi Saito, in a confidential report, summed it up with frustration. "It's like fighting talking shadows. We listen, but we don't understand. It's as if nature itself is on their side." The sound war was lost, and in the next part, we will see how this ancestral code not only resisted, but led the most critical moments of the conflict. Because on Iwo Jima, the Navajo broadcast didn't just coordinate battles. She orchestrated an entire invasion under fire, chaos, and utter silence from the enemy. From the success on Guadalcanal, the Marine High Command did not hesitate. The Navajo Code has gone from being an experimental curiosity to becoming operational doctrine. The original 29 coders were replicated in hundreds. Camp Elliott began to train new operators at a rapid pace, and in less than a year, the language that had been silenced by assimilation policies was now taught as a tactical tool. Each infantry division in the Pacific was given its own pairs of coders. Every mission, every landing, every advance under enemy fire, it all began with a broadcast on Navajo. The enemy listened, but did not understand, and the war became, every day, more asymmetrical. In November 1943, during the brutal Battle of Tarawa, coders coordinated naval bombardments in real time, redirecting battleship guns with margins of error of less than 15 meters, this while under direct fire, with the radios protected only by sandbags and conviction. The Japanese, until then masters at predicting movements, did not even know where to aim. Effectiveness increased as the system evolved. On Saipan, 1944, the Navajos were responsible for the medical evacuation of more than 500 wounded soldiers, coordinating extraction points with helicopters and boats in less than 5 minutes per call. The orders were clear, short, impenetrable. A single mistake could mean dozens of deaths, but there were no mistakes. Each message was conveyed with symbolic, memorized vocabulary: Chedagahi for tanks, TSAE for grenades, Tikin for ice, used as a code for blood plasma. Language became an invisible map over the battlefield, connecting points that Japan would never locate. The biggest test would come in Peleliu. The island, small and highly fortified, required coordination that defied the very military logic of the time. With traditional cipher systems, transmitting orders during combat in dense jungles and underground caverns would be virtually impossible. But with the coders, the orders flowed. A radio turned on, a spoken word, and within seconds, the artillery changed targets, the infantry advanced, resupply was released. The enemy listened, but he did not react. American superiority was no longer just in armor or aircraft. It was in response time, in trust, and in total silence on the other end of the line. On Iwo Jima, the code reached its operational apotheosis. 48 Navajo code talkers participated in the invasion. In 72 hours, they transmitted more than 800 messages with 100% accuracy. They coordinated naval bombardments, air raids, company advances, rescues of isolated units, and supply calls. Amid the crossfire, buried in shallow trenches or sheltered behind volcanic rocks, the coders were the veins of the war corps. The tactical pulse passed through their voices, and no transmission was lost. None were intercepted. None was understood. On the island where the United States faced the fiercest resistance of the Pacific Campaign, the coders kept the war machine moving. Invisible, unbreakable, indispensable. Meanwhile, Japan doubled down on its technological bet. More radios, more antennas, more interceptors. At a secret base in Yokosuka, engineers tested an automatic transcription system that converted Navajo transmissions into high-definition spectrograms. The hope was that visual analysis would reveal hidden patterns. The result, thousands of charts, and zero comprehension. The tones varied. Phonetic structures changed. The vocabulary was never measurably repeated. The only constant was failure. The technical complexity of the Japanese response contrasted with the strategic simplicity of American doctrine. Victory was in words, not machines. The cumulative effect of this was devastating. In 1942, Japan still possessed interception control over 70% of Allied transmissions in the Pacific. By 1944, that number had plummeted to less than 5%. The Navajo Code didn't just endure, it redefined the battlefield. Messages no longer needed to be encrypted, printed, or decoded. They were spoken, direct, clean, among soldiers who trusted each other and mastered a logic that the enemy could not even name. The old Japanese obsession with intercepting has become irrelevant. They picked up voices, but they didn't capture anything. This strategic dominance had another side effect. It freed American forces from the bureaucracy of mechanical ciphers. While the Germans still relied on trained operators to handle Njima, which took an average of 20 minutes to encode and decode a message, the Navajos in the field did so in real time, under pressure, with superior accuracy. And here's a direct comparison. While the Germans produced 30,000 cipher machines throughout the war, The United States trained just over 400 Navajo coders, 400 men, against machines that required maintenance, spare parts, trained operators, and yet they were defeated. A well-trained voice cost less, missed less, and lived longer, even under enemy fire. The Japanese couldn't see that. They kept waiting for a machine, for a pattern, for a failure. But the error was not in the code. It was on the assumption that every code can be broken. The Navajo language was born not to be translated, and that's precisely what made it perfect for war. The sounds came from the earth, the wind, the spirit, and no algorithm achieves this. And at the moment when this invisible weapon reached its tactical apex, a new operation would require the impossible, coordinating multiple battalions in real time, under fire, on an island surrounded by death on all sides. It was Okinawa. And there, more than ever, code would not be just a tool. It would be the line between collapse and victory. In the early morning hours of February 19, 1945, while darkness still covered the volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo code talkers landed along with the first waves of infantry. They did not carry heavy weapons, nor did they command platoons. But in the backpacks, protected by waterproof tarpaulins, were the SCR-300 radios, and in the mind, a code that was worth more than entire rooms. When the first shots cut through the air, they were already transmitting. Inside makeshift bunkers, in foxholes, or behind tanks, their voices began to weave the invisible mesh that would hold the operation together. In 48 hours, they would send more than 800 messages. None intercepted, none deciphered, none wrong. The island of Iwo Jima was more than a strategic point on the map. It was a bastion. Japan had turned it into a maze of tunnels, fortifications, and machine gun nests. Every American approach was guarded. Every artillery was given adjusted coordinates. The expectation was for a massacre, and it came. But what saved the first wave of Marines was not just naval support or air power. It was the absolute coordination allowed by uninterrupted, secure, and fast communications. Whereas it took a traditional operator minutes to cipher a forward order, Navajo coders did it in seconds, even under fire, even with explosions all around, even with the radio vibrating from interference. A request for air support went out in 20 seconds, an open flank alert on 15, an order of tactical retreat in 10. Inside a fortified cave on Mount Suribachi, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island's Japanese commander, watched the maps with growing frustration. His intercepts said nothing. Operators reported constant transmissions on a standard American frequency, but the words, even recorded and slowed down, remained incomprehensible. Field reports indicated that the Americans were moving accurately over hidden positions, as if guessing the hiding places. American artillery anticipated Japanese deployments with enough time to relocate fire. Japanese intelligence, which in previous campaigns had been able to anticipate movements and prepare ambushes, now operated blindly. For the first time, Japan fought without listening. On the American side, the perception was clear. The coders were the vital link in the offensive. The Marines trusted them with their lives. If their radio failed, we would die, a sergeant in the 5th Division would later say. But they did not fail. They broadcast from craters, from smoke-covered outposts, with their hands smeared with blood and their eyes attentive to the radio. And yet every message arrived. A mistake, a misspelled letter, an animal used out of the ordinary, could mean friendly fire or loss of position. But there were no mistakes. Because each of the coders had been trained with ruthless discipline, because they knew their voices were deadlier than an entire battalion poorly coordinated. On the second day of battle, as Japanese resistance intensified in the center of the island, the Navajos were called upon to coordinate a 3-pronged assault between infantry, Shermans, and air support. 9 tactical orders were transmitted in less than 3 minutes, with 3 operators taking turns to keep the channel open. The offensive worked with surgical synchrony. The artillery eliminated the first rows of pillboxes. The tanks advanced in the open corridors, and the infantry cleared the tunnels meter by meter. All of this guided by words that the enemy never understood. General Holland Smith, commander of the V Amphibious Corps, officially stated after the battle, "Without the Navajo coders, we would not have conquered Iwo Jima." The phrase was not rhetorical, it was recognition. In a scenario where every second defined life or death, where smoke and chaos prevented visual signals, sound was sovereign. And that sound was Navajo. Radio is no longer vulnerability. It has become an absolute advantage, a war system that spoke softly and won high. Meanwhile, in the basements of Japanese intelligence, the charts piled up. Each transmission was recorded, copied, analyzed, but none made sense. Frustration reached its peak when analysts realized that even identical messages, such as attack coordinates, never came with the same sound structure. There was no standardization. There was no sequence. The code adapted in real time, and that made any attempt to break it useless. Japan, with all its science, had lost to the unpredictable, for the symbolic, for oral. By the end of the battle, 6,800 Americans were dead, more than 20,000 injured. On the Japanese side, more than 18,000 dead. And yet, the coders remained. Of the original 6 landed, all survived the first 72 hours. Everyone fulfilled each transmission. They all left the island with the same silence with which they entered, and with the certainty that they had won a war without firing a single shot. From then on, there was no longer any doubt. The Navajo Code was more than a tool. It was a first-rate strategic weapon, and while Japan was trying to understand how it had lost the ability to hear, the United States was already preparing for the biggest operation of all, Okinawa, a battle where the sound would be even more chaotic, the landings even wider, and the need for coordination more critical than ever. And it would be there, between mud, death, and desperate resistance, that Japanese silence would turn into total collapse. On April 1, 1945, the first U.S. landing ships arrived on the beaches of Okinawa. The still dark sky heralded not only the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific theater, but also the Japanese Empire's last chance to reverse the impending collapse. At the center of this operation, invisible among more than 180,000 soldiers, were 35 Navajo coders, positioned on different fronts operating without rest. Divided into rigorous shifts, they worked day and night coordinating naval bombardments, troop movements, requests for medical evacuation, relocation of armored vehicles, and the entire logistical network that supported the advance. Each message transmitted with clarity, speed, and absolute secrecy. The island, covered in mud, blood, and smoke, became the largest stage of American informational supremacy. Japan knew that this was their last opportunity to inflict a coup. He knew that if he lost Okinawa, the path to the main archipelago would be wide open. And he knew, above all, that his enemy moved on the basis of inaccessible communications. For the first time, Japanese intelligence attempted to interfere directly with the Navajo system. Signal jamming equipment was positioned at high points on the island. White noise waves were transmitted on the same frequencies used by the Marines. Microtransmitters tried to sabotage the channel with random sounds. None of these attempts had any effect. The encoders changed frequencies in seconds. They alternated modulations. They reconfigured the radios manually under pressure, maintaining the clarity of the orders with the same calmness as always. The Japanese operators knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what. Frustrated, they resorted to what was left: imitation. A Japanese Navy lieutenant, known for his command of English and Mandarin, received recorded excerpts from Navajo broadcasts and tried to reproduce the sounds in the laboratory. There were hours of listening, repetition, phonetic adjustments. At the end of 2 days, he presented himself to the command with the proposal to carry out a camouflaged transmission to confuse the American operators. The recording was made, the message sent, and the result was so disastrous that it provoked muffled laughter among the officers present. The lieutenant, though accurate in his imitation, did not understand that he was not imitating sounds, but spirits. What I was trying to copy was not a sequence of phonemes. It was a living culture, a cadence that came from generations of orality, from inherited metaphors, from rhythms learned in childhood. The attempt to copy without understanding has definitively revealed the abyss between technique and essence. On the battlefield, the contrast was brutal. While the Japanese, trapped in underground networks, expected predictable movements, the Americans advanced with a fluidity that seemed impossible. The coordination was so precise that in a single day, more than 300 transmissions were made by encoders operating on 4 different fronts, all synchronized, all correct. A single mistake could cost an entire battalion, but mistakes never came. The words chosen with rigor, the codes mentally reviewed every hour, the radios manually adjusted with improvised tools. In the midst of the mud and blood, the codifiers kept the war cohesive. Reports from the time reinforced the importance of enemy silence. A U.S. Navy intelligence officer present at the operation noted in his diary, "We have never seen such an absence of Japanese reaction. It's as if they were deaf. But they are listening. But they don't understand." The effect of this was overwhelming. Every coordinated attack, every repositioning of troops, every resupply went unanswered. Japan still possessed soldiers, ammunition, and determination. But he no longer had any listening. He fought blindly. He reacted late. And when he reacted, it was too late. The end was sealed. And so is the humiliation. In classified documents found after the surrender, Japanese officials recount their last desperate attempts to capture enemy operators alive, hoping to force the breaking of the code. But no Navajo code talkers were captured in Okinawa, and none gave in to fear. Each one fulfilled their function with mathematical precision. The broadcast of the American victory was already written even before the shots were fired, in the voice of those who carried the memory of those who were never heard. The Japanese Empire, which prided itself so much on its discipline, its engineering, its analytical capacity, was defeated by something that never fit into formulas. A language created to survive, despised for decades, now stood as a symbol of invisible power, the one that radars do not detect, algorithms do not understand, and military manuals do not explain. War, for Japan, was no longer about territory or weapons. It was about not being able to comprehend what was being said in front of his own ears. And as silence gripped the Japanese bunkers on Okinawa, a new chapter was preparing to be written, no longer with cipher words, but with acknowledgement, because in the post-war period a new enemy would emerge, oblivion, and the men who won with their voice would have to fight once again, not to be erased from the very history they helped to win. With the end of the war, Japanese intelligence files began to be opened, not by their own volition but by force of surrender. Among the piles of documents recovered by American forces, a pattern was repeated. Entire folders with recordings labeled only as unknown voice, unidentified language, no possible decoding. They were the Navajo transmissions, captured over almost 4 years, and stored on carefully cataloged tapes. The empire, which prided itself on its engineering of listening, had recorded every word, but had never understood any. And the most bitter realization came in the personal testimonies. A colonel in the Naval Intelligence Section wrote in his final report, "The communications of the United States Marines remained impenetrable until the last day. We did everything, and we failed." During the war, the Japanese believed they were one step ahead. The cracking of the Purple Code and the success in interceptions in Southeast Asia had fueled absolute confidence in its ability to decipher. But with the Navajo Code, that trust turned to frustration, and, over time, despair. There were more than 1,500 broadcasts analyzed during the Iwo Jima campaign alone. None deciphered, not even an approximation. The only constant in the reports was a recurring expression, "No phonetic parallels possible." It was at this stage that the Japanese sought outside help. In 1944, a formal request was sent to the German High Command, requesting linguistic support for analysis of North American Indian languages. The answer was dry and embarrassing. The indigenous languages of the United States are not the subject of German military academic study. To the Nazi war machine, these languages were irrelevant, seen as vestiges of primitive peoples, incapable of offering any strategic advantage. Linguistic prejudice has become, once again, an operational blindness. And here it is worth pausing for a direct comparison. While the United States trained, and mobilized more than 400 Navajo code talkers for complex operations in real time, Germany never trained a single Native American language specialist. Result? Japanese intelligence was isolated, and the code remained unbreakable. Were you surprised by this data? Comment on absolute power or logistics wins to help more people know the real impact of these numbers. In the months following the surrender, Japanese officers interviewed by the Allies demonstrated an evident emotional pattern: shame, not because of the military defeat itself, which could be attributed to American material superiority, but because of the absolute failure of its intellectual elite. Men who had deciphered Soviet and British systems and even codes ciphered by electromechanical machines could not understand a language spoken by men who, until recently, were forbidden to use their own names in schools. The collapse was not only technical, it was moral. There were late attempts to justify the failure. Some analysts claimed that the language was unscientific, that is, it did not obey the known phonetic and syntactic logics. Others suggested that Americans used a theatrical form of language designed to confuse. None of these theories stood up to scrutiny. The truth was simpler and more painful. The Japanese had faced something they did not recognize as worthy of respect, and therefore they were not prepared. By treating language as noise, they despised the most powerful of the elements of war, secure communication. In the end, frustration turned to silence. The report ceased. The wiretaps were archived. And between the lines of the documents one could read a resignation that would never be said out loud. The empire, which believed itself superior in discipline, intelligence, and perseverance, had been defeated by something that could not be measured in lines of code or radio decibels. He had been defeated by men who did not use ciphers. They used stories, metaphors, and memory. And while these documents gathered dust in Tokyo on the other side of the Pacific, the American government made a decision that would change the fate of these men, to keep the Navajo program in absolute secrecy. No medals, no mention, no credit. What had been the invisible key to victory would now be erased from the record in the name of national security. But the men who spoke without being understood would now also be forgotten without being recognized. The war to beat Japan was over, but the fight for memory and dignity was just beginning. What made the Navajo Code inviolable was not just the rarity of the language, it was the hidden, meticulously designed structure that hid behind the words, a system within the system. Each letter of the alphabet was represented by multiple terms, selected based on visual metaphors and symbolic nature. The letter A, for example, could be coded as ant, apple, or arrow, depending on the operation. This created a layer of variability that disoriented any attempt at static mapping. But the sophistication did not stop there. For each relevant military word, such as tank, artillery, bomber, the code datallists developed image translations that had no direct equivalence in the traditional Navajo language. One bomber was a lightning bird, a tank, iron turtle, an aircraft carrier, floating eagle's nest. It wasn't just translation. It was strategic linguistic reinvention, shaped to flow naturally among trained speakers, but to be indecipherable to any outside listener, even if that listener was an untrained Navajo. And this is not rhetoric. During the war, at least 2 civilian Navajos were captured by the Japanese in occupied territories. Both listened to broadcasts and were interrogated for months. Both confirmed the language, but none knew how to decipher a single instruction, not even the most basic, because the code wasn't just spoken, it was practiced, rehearsed, perfected in rigorous training that required speed, memory, and absolute fidelity. There were no notebooks, no manual was produced. The entire system was transmitted orally, memorized silently, and used under fire. It was the total denial of writing, of external decoding of documentation. The only way to break that code was to become part of it. The discipline of the coders was absolute. In training, if a transmission error occurred, such as confusing hummingbird with falcon, or inverting the sequence of a coordinate, the soldier was subjected to new tests until he reached 100% accuracy. Speed was also controlled. The ideal was to transmit an encoded message 15 times faster than with traditional encryption machines, such as the M209, and this happened consistently. The performance of the Navajos was monitored by the command with accurate statistics. In the 1943 internal tests, the error rate recorded was less than 1% in more than 3,500 messages sent, a number that no machine at the time could reach. The code was as fast as it was reliable, and as invisible as it is deadly. This combination created a paradox. The more effective the code became, the more it needed to be invisible, not just to the enemy, but to the country itself. The American High Command knew that if any part of that system leaked, the entire program would be compromised. Therefore, the isolation was total. The coders did not explain their functions even to platoon mates. Messages were exchanged between specific pairs. A Navajo broadcast. Another one received it. Both knew that any failure would put hundreds of lives at risk. It was a network of restricted, almost ritualistic trust. And the most ironic, this invincible system, this jewel of war cryptography, was based on a language that the American government itself had tried to erase. Until 1934, the use of the Navajo language was prohibited in public schools. Children were punished for speaking their ancestral language. Some had their mouths washed with soap, others were beaten. What in 1942 saved lives on the beaches of the Pacific a decade earlier was treated as a national shame. And this paradox, between oppression and glory, oblivion and survival, made the code even more powerful, because he didn't just resist the external enemy, he survived the attempt at internal erasure. From the point of view of Japanese intelligence, this complexity was unthinkable. His model of cryptanalysis was based on rational patterns, systematization, and binary logic. They were looking for repetitions, phonemes, acoustic signatures, but the Navajo code defied all of these assumptions. It was redundant by design, variable by principle, contextual by culture. The same word could have 3, 5, or 7 variations depending on the mission, and the intonation, nasal, aspirated, guttural, altered the meaning without warning. This explained why no pattern emerged from the recordings, because the code had been built to look like natural language between two speakers, but totally misshapen for any external analyst. And the most brilliant, the code evolved. New terms were added as the theater of operations changed. New metaphors were created when equipment appeared that did not exist before. Radar has become an eagle's eye, the flamethrower, dragon's tongue, the phosphorus bomb, cloud that burns. Each new weapon required a new image, and each image was assimilated in silence, memorized, applied on the field. A living dictionary in constant mutation, impossible to be frozen on paper. It was language as an organic weapon, something that the Axis military doctrine never conceived. By the end of the war, the United States had trained 421 Navajo code talkers. None had their code broken. None betrayed. None failed on the field. It is the only communication force of the Second World War with an absolute inviolability rate. And yet, when they returned, many of these men could not tell what they had done. The program was confidential. The secret remained. Even their families did not know that they had been the invisible voice of victory. But the next part will reveal the cost of that silence. Because in order to keep the code inviolable, the country itself had to bury its authors. And the story that Japan never knew, the United States almost blacked out by choice. When the ships returned to port and applause filled the train stations, the men who had saved lives with silent words disembarked alone. There were no bands, banners, or honors. The Navajo code talkers returned to the Arizona and New Mexico reservations with the same silence they had maintained during the war. The country that had conquered with its language now received them as if they were invisible, and in fact, they were. The program was top secret. None of them could reveal what they had done, nor to his wife, nor to his children, nor to the community itself. The language that had protected entire battalions now became a burden, and silence, which had been a weapon, became a sentence. The irony was absolute. They had been trained by the Marine Corps, sworn to secrecy, faced grenades and machine guns. They had coordinated raids on Iwo Jima, saved entire companies on Saipan, secured evacuations on Okinawa under direct fire. But when they returned to being what the country had always made them to be. A footnote. Many did not have the right to vote. Some were barred from restaurants with signs that said, "No entry of Indians and dogs." Others were forced to undergo cultural re-education programs, which required them to speak only English, the same language that had saved no one on the Pacific beaches. The trauma was twofold. First, the war. Then, silence. Many have carried this story for decades inside their chests. Marine Dan Aki, who participated in the Tarawa and Iwo Jima campaigns, said years later, "I carried this secret for 23 years. Not even my wife knew what I was doing. When she dreamed of the cries of war, she thought it was a nightmare. It was translation. The memory of the combats was encoded even in dreams. But outside the trenches, no one wanted to decode it. There was no medal. There was no parade. Just oblivion. And forgetting was not an accident. It was politics. The U.S. government kept the program classified until 1968, more than 2 decades after the end of the war. In the meantime, dozens of coders have died without ever having received public recognition. Some have lived in extreme poverty. Others were admitted to psychiatric hospitals with post-traumatic disorders. And many, even after the disqualification, were not located. Because there were no records. Their names were in secret files. Their stories lost on missions that no one documented. An army of voices buried by the very country they had helped to save. And all this, it is worth remembering, while the United States advanced in its technological race, celebrating computers, radars, atomic bombs, the nation that had won with the symbol of modernity forgot that, on the real front, the difference had been made by an ancestral language, by an oral logic that no computer could replicate. The doctrine of technological superiority eclipsed cultural truth, because recognizing the codifiers meant admitting that, in the middle of the 20th century, the United States won not because of its modernity, but because of the forgotten wisdom of its native peoples. The wound was not only from the Navajo, it was the American ideal itself. A country founded on the idea of freedom but which ignored the freest. An industrial empire that defeated fascism with the help of peoples that it itself marginalized. The victory in the Pacific had been, in part, an Indian victory. But this part did not fit in the official speeches. It didn't fit in school books. And for decades, it didn't even fit in the Pentagon Papers. It was only in the 1980s that the first public recognitions began to emerge. Belatedly, with the delivery of medals and symbolic tributes. But for many, it was too late. Coder Lloyd Oliver, one of the first to be recruited, was already suffering from Alzheimer's when he received his decoration. He no longer remembered the messages, nor the sounds, nor of the code. It was as if the country had waited until the voices died out on their own. And even in the recognitions, the tone was one of debt, not celebration. Senator Jeff Bingaman, in introducing the congressional proposal to honor the coders, said on the floor, "It's a national shame that these men have had to wait so long to be recognized. Because history is not only made of deeds, it is made up of what one chooses to remember. And what the United States almost forgot was that its greatest weapon was the word of those it itself tried to silence. But this silence, imposed for decades, would begin to be broken by another front, cinema. And when Hollywood decided to tell this story, it did so not out of compassion, but out of historical urgency. The next part will show how the entertainment industry brought to the world a truth that the government tried to hide, and how, once again, language, this time on screen, would restore the honor of those who won with the voice. In July 2001, almost 6 decades after the end of the war, the halls of the U.S. Capitol witnessed a scene that had never happened before. Men with indigenous features, gray hair, and traditional Navajo robes climbed the steps of the Senate to receive, from the hands of the President of the United States, the Congressional Gold Medal. It was the highest civilian recognition in the country, but it wasn't just a medal. It was an apology in the form of metal, a late gesture that tried to restore what silence had eroded: memory. Among the honorees were only 5 of the original coders. The other 416 had already left, some without ever having told what they did, others forgotten by statistics and by their own homeland. What the country delivered that day was not just honor, it was wasted time, but the eyes of each survivor there showed something more powerful than hurt, restored dignity. From this public recognition, a new phase began. The coders began to be invited to tell their stories in schools, universities, and military institutions. What was once forbidden now became an example. Young Navajo, who had grown up hearing that their language was useless, began to study it with pride, no longer as a cultural relic but as living proof that his identity had saved a nation. Educational programs sprang up on the reservations to revitalize the language. Historical coding courses were created to teach new generations how their ancestors built one of the most effective codes in modern military history. The language that had been stifled was now recorded, documented, celebrated. The tongue breathed again. In 2008, the Navajo National Coders Memorial was opened in Phoenix, Arizona, a space of stone, silence, and ancestral echoes, where the name of each warrior linguist is engraved. Visitors leave flowers, children ring names with reverence, veterans take off their hats, It is a sanctuary of language as resistance. And there, between dates and names, an inscription sums up the paradox of history. What was forbidden, won. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. A language that the government itself tried to erase became the most reliable shield of its war machine. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content, because there are still many stories like this, buried by silence and time. More than decorations, the true impact of the recognition was symbolic. For the first time, America looked into the eyes of an indigenous group and said, "You saved our lives." And this public validation transcended politics. In 2013, during the Memorial Day ceremony, the U.S. Marine Corps Commandant's speech used an unusual phrase for military vocabulary, "Our brothers of sacred speech." It was the first time that a leader of the armed forces had referred to the Navajo language with this expression, and this change in tone indicated something deeper, a cultural turn. The recognition did not erase the injustices of the past, but it offered an honest mirror for the country to see itself. In telling this story, the U.S. government recognized that its military superiority, so often attributed to tanks, planes, and bombs, also depended on something older, more human, more invisible, the soul of a people who knew how to resist when everything around them called for silence. And this changed the way the Army itself began to think about communication. Intelligence programs began to study codes based on minority languages. The NSA agency analyzed the success of Navajo as a case of organic encryption. And even cinema, usually slow to recognize peripheral voices, decided to act. In 2002, the film Wind Talkers, starring Nicolas Cage, brought to the screens of the world a fictionalized version of the story. Although criticized for centering a white character, the feature had the merit of bringing millions of viewers to know for the first time the existence of the coders. Schools began to ask for copies. Teachers began to use scenes to explain World War II in another light. Popular culture, which had previously ignored them, now placed them at the center. And even though the film's script wasn't historically perfect, it fulfilled a role that no military directive could fulfill, opening the audience's hearts to a forgotten truth. Today, the descendants of the codifiers proudly speak on behalf of their own. Some serve in the armed forces, others in educational institutions. But everyone carries one certainty: the world knows. And this certainty in itself is a form of justice. What was marginal has become central. What was silence became a voice. What was hidden became a symbol of military excellence. And if war has any kind of legacy that goes beyond pain, perhaps it is this: the revelation that the real strength is not only in the numbers, in the armored vehicles, in the factories. It is in the right word, spoken at the right time, with the conviction of someone who carries centuries of living memory. But there is still something to be unraveled. Because even with the late recognition, a question echoes behind the scenes of history. What if the Navajo code had been used in Europe as well? The next part reveals what the Allies thought of, and why they didn't dare. The American victory in the Pacific was not just a triumph of bombs and ships. It was living proof that, in an all-out war, culture is also a weapon. While the Japanese Empire structured its doctrine on a logic of purity, homogeneity, and hierarchical discipline, the United States, in the midst of its own internal contradictions, did something that its enemy never considered. It transformed diversity into a military tool. The Navajo language, which had been repressed, disowned, and erased on American soil, became the linchpin of a tactical security operation that no Japanese algorithm could penetrate. And more than a cryptographic feat, it was a philosophical turn. The Navajo code won because it was alive, not programmed, because it carried symbols, not just sounds, because it was born of experience and not of formulas. Japan, with all its technical structure, its elite schools, and its imperial pride, did not know how to process what could not be classified. Every attempt to break the code failed not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of too much rigidity. The Japanese mental structure, shaped by decades of nationalism and hierarchization, required everything to be orderable, segmentable, predictable. But the Navajo code did not obey any logic that could be drawn on blackboards. He defied conventional standards. The same word could have multiple meanings. The metaphors changed according to the context. The grammatical structure was agglutinative, fluid, moldable in real time. What for the Japanese was chaos, for the Navajos was ancestral clarity. This cultural asymmetry turned into military advantage, and the United States, perhaps by the force of its own plural nature, was able to absorb this and use it against the enemy. It is here that war reveals its deepest level, the philosophical. While Japanese planners relied on mathematical cryptography, the United States bet on an oral form of intelligence, something that could not be copied without experience. The empire, blinded by the idea that only engineers and mathematicians could win a war of signals, was defeated by men who had learned their metaphors by listening to stories around fire. Japanese doctrine ignored the imponderable, the human factor, language as a living phenomenon, and he paid the price. During the final years of the war, the Japanese General Staff made a number of reports about interception failures. In all of them, the pattern was the same. American communications were picked up with technical perfection, but without any operational value. One of the notes, made by a lieutenant in the Tokyo Communications Unit, said, "Transmissions are like rain. They are there, we hear, we feel them, but we cannot hold them." It was the final acknowledgement of a defeat that came not from arms, but from language. In contrast, the United States has learned to look inward. The Coders program paved the way for other intelligence initiatives based on cultural diversity. Choctaw, Comanche, and Lakota tribes were evaluated for future operations. The logic had changed. What was once treated as folklore was now considered a strategic asset. The war had taught a bitter but powerful lesson. What seemed primitive was actually superior, because it was invisible to the enemy. This philosophical learning was reflected even in later military manuals. In 1953, the Department of Defense published an internal report that read, "The strength of an army lies not only in its ability to destroy, but in its ability to understand." And this understanding began to include the unpredictable, the symbolic, the oral. The American victory in the Pacific was not just a logistical or technological feat. It was a moral blow against intellectual arrogance. And at the center of this coup was an ancestral language, spoken by a people that the country itself had tried to silence. The great irony of the story is that the Japanese had state-of-the-art technology, oscilloscopes, tonal analysis systems, operators trained in the most advanced schools in Asia. But none of this worked, because they were trying to decipher the sound, not the spirit. The war has taught, perhaps in the cruelest way, that there are things that machines cannot measure, and that codes are not broken only with logic, but with listening, real listening, human. Meanwhile, the United States mobilized the largest industrial machine ever seen in modern history. Every minute, a new Jeep was assembled. Each day, dozens of B-24 planes took off from production lines that never stopped. And yet, with all this apparatus, it was a group of young indigenous people, with their headphones and microphones, who ensured the security of communications. A language spoken by less than 0.1% of the American population was responsible for keeping more than 800,000 men connected on the battlefield. This is more than strategy, it's military counterculture. It is a country winning not by standardization, but by exception, by the forgotten voice. And if that seems unlikely, remember, the Germans didn't even consider using tribal languages as a code. For the Third Reich, there was no military value in indigenous cultures. The Enigma encryption system, with all its engineering, was broken by Polish and British scientists. The Navajo code, oral, mutable, metaphorical, remained intact. From the beginning to the end of the war, perhaps in the end, the most powerful message that the coders conveyed was not in code, but in existence. That identity, when respected, is brute force. But war never ends with battles. And in the next part, we will reveal what the coders themselves thought, in their words, diaries, and interviews, about what they experienced. What did they feel? What did they fear? And why, even after the victory, did many of them remain in absolute silence? In the shielded silence of the NSA's security rooms between state-of-the-art servers and algorithms that process trillions of data per second, there is a phrase that circulates with almost ritual respect. Not everything can be deciphered. It doesn't come from mathematical formulas or artificial intelligence research. It comes from the Pacific battlefield, 1942. The success of the Navajo Code was so absolute so inaccessible that it began to intrigue not only historians, but digital security engineers. When the Cold War demanded new levels of informational protection, American intelligence revisited the past. The Department of Defense commissioned studies on languages that are difficult to translate, especially those based on orality, metaphors, and contextual structures. What the coders had done, often with paper, memory, and intuition, began to be seen as natural engineering, a symbolic architecture that escaped binary standards. In the midst of the computing age, the U.S. turned its eyes to something older than any processor: the living language. Cryptography experts have come to study Navajo code not as a historical curiosity, but as a technology. The absence of physical records, the variability of expressions, the resistance to literal translation, all of these proved extremely effective against traditional methods of decoding. In 1989, an internal CIA report stated that the cultural complexity of certain tribal languages exceeds the power of any known decoder machine. And this was aggravated by the advance of quantum computing, which promised to break security systems based on numerical factorization. What would protect data in a future where all algorithms could be broken? The answer began to emerge in unexpected directions: language, emotion, context. Elements that mathematical logic does not capture. Elements that the Navajos had used without computers to win the greatest war in history. This reasoning gave rise to a new school within information security: cultural cryptography, a field that explores the idea that safer codes can be born from unpredictable human patterns, such as dialects, oral traditions, regional language games. Instead of encrypting data with software-generated keys, the proposal is to protect it with keys based on inimitable cultural structures. One example was tested in 2016, when researchers at the University of New Mexico created a military communication system based on the Zuni language. The result: the system withstood all decoding attacks during testing, and more importantly, it worked with speed and operational clarity. The Indigenous past was helping to shape the digital future. Navajo encryption has also influenced the concept of invisible security: defense structures that do not rely on the strength of blocks, but on the absence of standard. It's the opposite of what most technologies were looking for: predictability, repetition, logic. Here the strength is in the apparent chaos, in the symbolic context, in subjectivity. And as strange as it may seem, this is extremely efficient, because hackers, like the cryptographers of the past, rely on finding pattern. When there is no standard, there is no input. A defense system based on codified orality is like a foreign language spoken in the dark. Those who were not born in it do not penetrate. Today, several U.S. security agencies maintain study programs with indigenous and exotic languages, precisely because they recognize their cryptographic potential, and the impact doesn't stop there. The initiative also contributed to the preservation of these languages. What was once considered archaic and dispensable is now part of national security strategies. The Navajo language, which was once banned in American schools, is now taught on military bases. What was marginal has become central. What was folklore has become a tool. And this represents more than a technical breakthrough. It represents an ethical turnaround. It is in this twist that the greatest irony lies. The safest codes of the 21st century were born of cultures that the West itself tried to erase. In a world obsessed with speed and precision, the U.S. won a war with animal metaphors and sacred words. And this same model now helps to protect banks, satellites, diplomatic networks. What was improvised became doctrine. What was an exception became an example. There is no firewall more effective than a language that no one outside of your people can decipher. And that truth, hard learned on the beaches of Guadalcanal and in the caves of Iwo Jima, now serves as a principle of global protection. Even today, at cybersecurity conferences, the Navajo case is cited as an example of unintentional genius, not because he was an amateur, but because he was born out of technical logic. It was functional, yes, but also symbolic. It was military, but also spiritual. It was limited to a small group, but it affected the fate of millions. The cryptography of the future, some say, will be as human as it is mathematical. And when that day comes, the first to understand this will have been men of ancestral origin, sitting in tropical bunkers, turning the invisible into tactical advantage. At its core, The Navajo code taught something that no machine can process. That language is more than sound. It's history. It is experience. It is the reflection of a collective memory that refuses to be silenced. And perhaps this is exactly what makes it inviolable. Because no one can decode what they don't even know how to name. But the code was not only inviolable, he was vital. And in the next part, we'll discover how, at critical moments in the war, a single coded broadcast determined the fate of thousands of lives in a matter of seconds. When the metaphor turned into ammunition, decades after the battles ended, as the rusty wreckage of battleships rested on the bottom of the Pacific, something unexpected emerged from Japanese universities: admiration. There were no more listening posts, no desperate attempts at decoding. Now, what was left was study, inquisitiveness, reverence. Japanese researchers began to delve into the mystery that had challenged the entire crypto-analytical elite of the empire. At first, the topic was treated with caution, a technical wound that was still open. But over time, the tone changed. In 1985, Professor Shigeru Yamada of the University of Tokyo published an article with a title that summed it all up: "The Encryption We Never Broken." The article not only described the technical aspects of the Navajo code, but extolled its cultural complexity as impenetrable by any Japanese structural analysis of the time. The admission was clear and definitive. The most symbolic transformation, however, came from within the retired Imperial Navy itself. In 1992, Admiral Hiroshi Suzuki, a veteran of the Pacific campaigns, gave an interview to Shukan Gendai magazine. In it, he declared, "The Navajo code was the only enemy communication that accompanied us from the first battle to the last, without ever giving us an advantage. It was, for me, perfect encryption." The phrase ran through Japan's academic and military circles. He who had once hunted the enemy with discipline and technology now revered his symbolic genius. The silence that had so frustrated the Japanese interceptors was now becoming an object of respect. It was as if the mystery, by not being overcome, had become sacred. Recognition crossed the physical world. In 2004, an exhibition at the Osaka War Museum included a sector entirely devoted to impossible-to-crack codes. In the center of the room, in a lighted window, was a reproduction of the Navajo phonetic alphabet used by the coders. Japanese visitors, including veterans and students, watched the combinations with amazement. One recording explained, in fluent Japanese, how metaphors such as turtle meant tank, how corn indicated battalion, and how a single word could change meaning according to context. The message of the exhibition was straightforward. Japan did not lose only by material inferiority. He lost by underestimating the power of a culture he did not understand. There were even attempts to recreate it. A linguistics institute in Kyoto simulated coded transmissions based on Ainu and Ryukyuan languages, trying to understand how oral structures could serve as a strategic barrier. The result was a mixture of frustration and fascination. Without cultural experience, communication is noise. It was the realization that even with goodwill, understanding did not emerge. The Navajo code could not be imitated, only respected. This respect has turned into a specific field of study within Japanese military academies. Codes based on orality, context, and metaphor have come to be considered non-replicable technologies, a kind of symbolic weapon whose effectiveness depends more on ancestry than on engineering. And it was at this point that history took its last turn. In 2015, the University of Tokyo invited two direct descendants of Navajo coders to a lecture on linguistics and cryptography. Both were grandchildren of veterans who had operated on the beaches of Peleliu and Saipan. For the first time, voices descended from those who had defeated the empire with words crossed the ocean not as enemies but as teachers. In the packed auditorium, a Japanese student asked, "Do you believe that Japan could have won if it had understood its culture?" The speaker replied serenely, "Maybe, but it would have been necessary to first respect our humanity." This answer was echoed long after the end of the lecture, because it contained what no cipher can express: the silent justice of history, the lesson that crosses generations and borders, the victory that is not only measured in conquered islands but in conquered recognition. The empire that had classified native languages as irrelevant now taught them in classrooms. The officer who had once signed frustrated reports now praised her beauty, and the country that had once tried to bend cultures by force now bowed to its complexity. There is something profoundly human about this cycle. A people that was invisible becomes visible. A language that has been ignored becomes respected. A code that has been cursed becomes a reference. Defeat reveals wisdom. Failure becomes learning. And the former enemies become, finally, witnesses to the same legacy. A legacy that has not yet ended. Because respect, like the best codes, is something that needs to be continually rebuilt. And that's exactly what we'll see in the next and final part. Because what these men left behind was not just a tactic of war, it was a moral testimony, a message that still needs to be deciphered by all of us. At the end of all the battles, when the dust of war settled and the empires were forced to face their own mistakes, one truth remained. Japan, with all its technical rigor and its elite crypto-analytical framework, failed not because of lack of discipline but because of too much certainty. The doctrine that prioritized hierarchy and predictability was unable to decipher what it could not control, the living soul of a culture. And with that, what seemed unbreakable in its own imperial machine was, piece by piece, dismantled by a marginalized language. The Navajo code didn't just endure, it won. The radio, radar, spectrogram, speech therapist, analyst, and general won. And by winning, he showed that war is not only fought with metal and gunpowder, but also with memory, identity, and ancestry. Because a nation's true strength lies not just in its tanks or aircraft carriers, but in the ability to recognize value where the enemy sees weakness. That was the ultimate lesson of the Pacific Campaign, that logistics determine strategy, but culture determines victory. In a world where everyone looked to algorithms and copper cables for solutions, the United States found power in something that couldn't be replicated. A living voice, shaped by generations, sealed by trust, and guided by honor. Japanese Colonel Katsumi Ihara, Chief of Communications for the Imperial Army on Okinawa, declared years later, with bitterness and respect, "It was never a war of machines. We were defeated by words we didn't understand, and that we never knew how to listen to." If this story resonated with you, if the impact of these facts revealed something that is not in traditional books, support our work. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Comment below which piece of data surprised you the most. The Japanese listening network with 500 operators, or the fact that not even an ordinary Navajo could understand the code without military training. Because it is in the analysis of the details that the complete truth is revealed. And don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.